we have seen that how ethical theories are often developed on the basis of these three types of theories of ethics. And the last topic that we had started yesterday and that we will talk about now in much more detail was that how ethics differs from the other system of norm. So we had seen yesterday, for example, first of all, that how ethics differs from religion. So ethics is an important system of norm in our society, but ethics is not the only system of norm. There are other systems of norms also which tell us what is right and what is wrong. Religion is one of them. So we had seen that how ethics differs from religion and how the two let's say, influence each other. That was one small topic, but the most important part of this topic is the second one that we'll be talking about today. So write down further, ethics and law. Ethics and law. Now, as I told you yesterday also, this topic that we are discussing here, yesterday we started with, is perhaps the most important topic from this type till now from our syllabus. So a few 3-4 questions have already been asked in the UPSC exam from this topic, and it is this ethics and law. So ethics and law is a very important topic from the examination point of view, because all the 3-4 questions that I mentioned, I will talk about some of them shortly, was from that topic itself. There was a question, for example, a few years ago, that you told 3 points are there, so we have done 2 only. Let us see, we'll talk about the rest of the 2. We have talked only 1. The other 2 we will talk about today. So there was a direct question a few years ago that write a short note on ethics and law. So in 150 words or so, you have to write whatever we are going to discuss in this topic, you can write that. So one question was there directly a short note on this thing that, and there are other questions also that I will mention shortly. So ethics and law is a very important topic from your examination point of view. So it's important to understand that more appropriately, because law, you know that every society has a number of law, and each law also tells us about what is right and what is wrong. So for example, in India, for example, well, there is a law that if you drive on the road, for example, then driving on the left side of the road is right and driving on the right side of the road will be wrong. So now if you're driving on the left side is right and driving on the right side is wrong, then there's nothing ethical about that. There's nothing religious also about that. It is just the law that we have. And if you change the law, then what is right can become wrong and what is wrong can become right. So for example, if you go to America, then driving on the right becomes right and driving on the left becomes wrong. There's nothing especially right about driving on the right or driving on the left. It is just that a law we have. So we have a different law in India and they have different law in America. So if you change the law, then right can become wrong also and wrong can become right also. So it's important for us to understand how is that ethical right and wrong differs from the legal right and wrong. So first of all, we'll talk about the same 2 differences that we talked about in yesterday's class also. So write down firstly, ethics is based on individual reason, while law is based on ethics is based on individual reason, while law is based on legislation. While the law is based on legislation. Now that can be a simple difference. Individual reason we had already talked about yesterday, that in the case of ethics, we reason out ourselves in our mind, and then after, on the basis of that reasoning, that logic, etc., we decide what is right and what is wrong. So individual reason matters, and because of the fact that our reason is different, so we think differently, we reason out differently. Law, on the other hand, something can become a law only and only when it is passed by a legislative body, like the parliament, like the assembly, senate, duet, etc., whatever it is. So only when it is passed by a legislative body, becomes legislature, for example, legislation, then only it can become a law. Now, this distinction that individual reason and the legislation by a parliament, for example, leads to many other differences also between the two. One important consequence of this fact is that law, if you look at it, law is a formal system of norm. Law is a formal system of norm in the sense that whenever you make a law, there's a whole process, formal process, that how to make a law. For example, in our country, in order to make a law, first of all, you have to make a proposal in the parliament, for example, in the form of a bill. So bill must be presented in the parliament where debate must happen. That is that's unlikely these days. Not much debate happens in the parliament. You know about that. But you can say law tells us that there must be a proper debate in the parliament about the law. So debate must happen there, and then after we can say it may be passed, referred to a legislative, can say small body also like parliamentary committee maybe. Then after it must be passed by a certain type of majority. Different types of majorities are there: simple majority, 2/3 majority, 3/4 majority, depending on what type of law we are in question. What are the law that we are talking about? So it must be passed by the parliament through a certain majority. Not only that, it must get the approval of the head of the state, like the president in India. Then also it will not become applicable law. After that, it must be notified in a gazette. So notified in the gazette, rules must be, I can say, made in that case. CA, for example, that CA already have been passed 2 years ago, more than 2 years, but still it has not become implemented because, well, notification has not been done and the rules have not been formed. So just by passing the law, and that is not enough, there is a formal process even after that. It must be notified in a gazette, for example. It must be, rules must be, you can say, established for that. And then also it must be advertised to the people in the newspapers in a certain manner so that people can know that there is a law that has been passed. So for everything there is a process, and if any of these processes is not properly followed, then that law will not become a law. So it's a formal process. Ethics, on the other hand, is not so formal. It is, we can say, it is a non-formal in the sense that each individual has his own way of deciding what to do ethically or not. So there is no formal procedure. Everybody has to follow the same procedure for that. So I can apply my own reasoning differently, make different method, for example, different process through which I can arrive at my right and wrong. And you can follow, you can go through a different set of processes in order to understand what you think is right and wrong. There is no formality into that. It is an informal process, firstly. Further important difference is that if you look at law, since it is based on legislation, so law always tries to be, law is an objective system of norm. What is the meaning of that? Objective system essentially means that in the case of law, law does not bother about whether you personally like it or not. It does not depend on you, whether you prefer it or not, you like it or not, you personally think that it is good or bad. So suppose, for example, even if you think that driving on the left side of the road is not a good idea, then also as long as you are in India, you have to follow that law. You cannot simply say, I don't like it, I don't want it, I don't consider that as right. So your personal opinion does not matter. It is just the, you can say, the law is there and it is objectively applied on everybody who is within the jurisdiction of that law, regardless of whether the person, the, you can say, target of the law, the person on which the law operates, does that person personally believe in that or not. Ethics, on the other hand, is subjective. Ethics, on the other hand, is subjective. What is the meaning of the term subjective? That ethics depends on the subject. So subject means we. So I can have some other right and wrong for in ethics, and you can have your own right and wrong that may differ from mine. So ethics is more or less subjective in that sense. Each individual has his own idea of right and wrong, his own understanding of right and wrong. It depends on the subject, the person who decides. And law, on the other hand, is more objective. So that is the meaning. What is the meaning of the term objective, by the way? Object? Anybody? Yes? Object is something, this is an object basically. Marker is an object. This bottle is an object. What is the definition of object? What can be an object? We'll discuss a lot about that in a later class. That is a part of our course. But here we can simply say object is something that does not make a decision. In a way, that's how you can say, and this is very important meaning that we'll discuss a lot in our later class. That it is a very important concept in the ethics also, that objectifying the human being, objectification of the human being. We'll talk about that in a later class. When do we consider human being as an object? So object, meaning of the object is that, idea of the object is that objects do not make a decision. They simply follow the decision made by some other authority. So this is an object, for example, if you leave this marker, it will simply go down because of the law of gravity. Similarly, if the law is there, so this law of gravity does not depend on this object, but it still operates upon that. Similarly, law made by the parliament does not depend on me personally. Well, I may or may not agree with that, but even then that law applies on me the way law of gravity applies on this object which falls down because of the same law. So people who do not make something that does not make a decision is object. So in the case of law, we do not make a decision. Who makes a decision? The parliament, the legislative body. So because of that, we often say law is an objective. Law is equally applied. Just as law of gravity, for example, applies on everything in the universe exactly in the same manner. Similarly, law also applies equally to everybody who is within the jurisdiction of that law, who is within the purview of that law. So that is the meaning. Subjective, on the other hand, subjects are who? Subjects are the people who make decision. So objects do not make decisions, subjects make decision. We'll talk a lot about that in a later class. So that is the second important thing that comes out from the same process, same difference that we talked about earlier. Further important thing is that if you look at law often talk about more specific and concrete behavior. So law often talks about, you can say, a specific and concrete behavior. So law does not talk about underlying principle, and that is not bothered about. So it simply tells you do this. So law simply tells you drive on the left side of the road, pay your tax. That is it. Whether you understand the underlying principle behind that or not, that is not something that law is much concerned about. You have to simply follow it, whether you know it or not, whether you understand this or not. So it is more about concrete, specific behavior that the people are expected to show under law. Ethics, on the other hand, often talks about more general and abstract principles. So ethics is more about identifying certain principles. We'll talk a lot about that a few days later, that what is the meaning of the term principles. Principles of morality, principles of ethics, and we will also see that how can we identify the principles? What are the principles on which we often make decisions? So in the case of ethics, we often try to identify some general and abstract principles, and on the basis of that, we derive our own behavior. So in this case, behavior is not determined. We choose our own behavior, we decide our own behavior, we derive our own behavior on the basis of some abstract and some general principles that we ultimately accept or we believe in. So that is the next important thing that differentiates between the two. So these are the things that you can write on that point, that individual region which determines ethics leads to these different distinctions, and the legislation which determines law leads to these distinctions here.